Okay, so tell me a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the disability community. In the community. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I love just in the community in general, and I've really been blessed that I've had kind of an interesting journey into my role as a disability rights advocate. So, um, I am from Boise, Idaho, and my name's Leann Naillon. I have worked in nonprofits my entire life. I was raised here in Boise, and I've lived in Montana, and I've also lived in Oregon. Never lived in Washington though. And so I'm just a Western girl who has disabilities, and I was born with them. My mom and I spent my first few months in a hospital with pneumonia and lung infections, and so. But I've never thought of myself as someone with a disability or maybe a part of the disability community, and that's a lot of just really great blessings I've had in my life. And so I started working in nonprofits as a camp director, or as a camp counselor actually, and then became a camp director. And at camp where I worked, it was a YMCA camp, and we don't turn anyone away for inability to pay. And as I started to get trained in that, I realized access was a big issue. If it was, do you have your medications you need? What happens if a camper who has epilepsy has an episode? And we were young adults that were in the woods taking care of campers and each other. And so it really did solidify we're so much better with differences, and that differences are advantages and people need one another. So that's kind of the start of my journey. And that's a little bit about me, Leann from Idaho,
Mm-hmm.
a white female. I'm white. I have blonde hair, and it is a little bit longer than my shoulders. And it's not actually blonde, so you can see it's darker on top because that's my natural hair color. But that is me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what sorts of work do you do in the community?
Yeah, I'm actually in transition of that work. So since I was working for Special Olympics Montana, I was their vice president of unified strategies. And I moved to Montana in 2009 to start in that work. So part of that work was unified sports. So students and adults with and without disabilities competing in sports and in play together. And they worked with the Department of Education. They had some federal funding through a lot of really amazing support programs. And through that, I got certified as what's called a Gallup Clifton Strengths Coach. And so I help people understand their natural patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And then I help them productively apply that using their strengths and using this tool. And the tool is really accessible. So I started Telos Coaching and Consulting because I moved back to Idaho, and I still had work from my international work. And so now I just do Telos Coaching and Consulting. It's a sole proprietorship, but we are actually going to be evolving. I'm going on a sabbatical. So this is like my first podcast and maybe my last for 12 weeks or so, if I ever get asked back. So yeah, so I just help people identify what they're good at and build on that, and then surround themselves with a network of people to navigate their blind spots.
Mm-hmm. Because that's was my next question. Like, what? Tell me a little bit about Taylor's Consulting. What's that all about?
Yeah, so Telos is a sole proprietorship that started because when I moved back to Idaho, I worked for, if your listeners aren't familiar, it's called the Center for Independent Living. And there's about 400 plus around the country, and it's a nonprofit. That center that I worked with, we have certain areas. So we covered Southwest Idaho, and it's a cross disability organization. And I learned a lot about activism and advocacy and being an advocate, but I also was going through my own disability. So when I was doing work for Talos, it created itself because we could only work in Southwest Idaho. But I've actually been honored to be a civilian diplomat for the Department of State on 2 different programs that they offer. And 2 of them were about adaptive sports, native games, and disability support. And I went to China and Laos for those. And so I was still doing work for Montana. So I created Telos as a sole proprietorship just to be able to put it on taxes or, do all those things that we get to do in the US when we make money. And so it created itself. And now I have left that nonprofit and I'm going to go on a little sabbatical, and Telos will be rebranded March 4th, 2024. And that is to honor Judy Human. So for those who are in the disability community, know Judy well, but I'm surprised how many people in education don't know about Judy. And so we're rebranding that, but it will be hopefully primarily disability owned, working to be women and disability owned majority. And we'll see where it goes. But Telos is just a little sole proprietorship that people ask me to do stuff and I do it. And it all has to do with disability. So I work with like marketing firms sometimes, and they talk about access, or, if they're creating digital content, what does digital content look like? Because most people that get those degrees in marketing and PR don't always get the digital accessibility component. And so I don't know that, but I connect them with a network that does. And then I show them why it's so important for their job to be accessible, not only for employees, but for their consumers.
Yeah, that was another question that I was going to jump into. Like, what kinds of services do you provide at Telos?
Yeah, it really is custom. We do group facilitation. So we have different packages, and I say we, and it's very humble we, because it's just me. But I have great networks and other people that are specialists. So sometimes I'm just the conduit, or like the connector of like, oh, here's a person, because we will go in and do an assessment if they're looking for Clifton Strengths through Gallup. And then we'll go in and also just do disability etiquette. But we're trying to rebrand that, because etiquette means there's a right and a wrong. And when you're talking about respect, and when you're talking about such a diverse community as ours, disability, you're going to mess it up. So there's kind of like, if we're talking about etiquette, right and wrong, it's really hard. So we'll go in and do workshops like that, and DEI trainings, but we only call them DEI trainings when that's the word that our clients use, but we help them change it to a better idea, which is inclusion, disability, equity, and access. So we just want to make sure that people are reminding that access is a really important part, because we can't have a seat at the table if there's not a space for someone who brings their own seat, and they can't get in there. So I advocate for that.
What kind of impact does your organization, your consulting group, have on the community as a whole? If you could talk about that a bit.
Yeah, we really focus on that strengths-based emotional intelligence, like learning. And so we don't really measure impact. I don't really measure impact by a set data. We do a training, we ask for evaluations. And I think most of the data isn't necessarily quantifiable as far as what our impact is. But what we strive to do is demystify disability and have people have a more open mind to have conversations. People are very scared to get sued. They're very scared to do the wrong thing, and they're very scared to say what they don't know, but they're very proud to say, oh, I have a friend with a disability and I can relate to that because they couldn't go to a concert. And it's like, that's a very valid relation, and there's so much more to it. So we just hope to like plant a seed, and then if enough seeds are planted, then people will fertilize each other, and the bees will come and all that lovely stuff. But at the end of the day, we just try to open conversations and let people know it's okay to be embarrassed. It's okay to be angry, but those are secondary emotions. So we got to get to the conversation piece. That's kind of the impact we try to make with people we talk to at the grocery store, or in one of our workshops or one-on-one coaching sessions.
Hmm. What sort of testimonials have you heard from people who were involved in your consulting group? You know, like if you could share any.
Yeah, I'll start with one that I think is funny. So I work internationally, and I've been doing a workshop for graduate students in social work at a university there in Beijing. And I always say, because you have interpreters and then you have translators, and one of my disabilities is I just don't process things well. So I collect books and I can't read them. Thank goodness for Audible and books on tape. They did not have that in the 8-track era, though. And so one of the takeaways I get a lot, and I try to say, I'm going to excite you. Like, I'm here to excite you to talk about things that are uncomfortable. And that doesn't always culturally translate when I'm on Zoom. And so the pandemic made it so that I still got to do those workshops because I couldn't do them in China. But so I said, I'm very excitable, and they always translate that or interpret it as hyper. So I think that's one thing I get is I'm hyper. But that's also just enthusiastic about the mission and what we're trying to do. Other feedback, we look at it in what does their civic engagement look like after a workshop or meeting one of us or a coaching session, executive or what have you. And one of the things, I just talked to someone today that is in the banking industry, and he works at a really interesting bank that's a community hub. So you don't have to bank there. It's downtown, it's accessible, and people could go in there and have meetings or do Zooms or prep for interviews. And then there's like a bank there. Then they'll host happy hours. And he was saying that one of the things that was most impactful was when we did a Blue Path service through the Boise Chamber. They have a leadership Boise program, and they went through, and Blue Path is online. I think it's bluepath.org, but it's a crowdsourced app that tries to help people prepare to go to a place with your family or for you. Where's the parking? Do they have Braille? Is the acoustics good? How's the lighting? Just that kind of stuff. And they work alongside with businesses. So we had done that in a chamber program. So he had said, that just changed my whole perspective on how we do this community hub. And they changed some seating, and it was still ADA accessible, but that was the 80s. And people like to remind me that was last century. That was the 90s. That was the 80s. I'm like, yeah, I know it was last century, but let's maybe revisit it or update it a little. It was so powerful when it was happening, but we didn't have digital. We had books on tape, not Audible. So it's just different time. We were fighting for different things for access. So I think that's one takeaway. I just look at what they do in their everyday lives. It's not just a shot in the arm, it's the what do you do after. So we've had people end up on boards for disability organizations. We've had people, we just launched a Power Independent Living campaign to support the direct care workforce. That marketing firm is incredible. So it's just what happens after the training. What was the actual takeaways? I'm not going to pop quiz them on the street, but they say they actually just are not as scared. And I don't want to be scared. I have mental health, and I'm scared all the time. So I'm very, I think, empathetic to people's feelings.
Hmm. Yeah. Lastly, how can you your work make a difference in people's lives? How can Telos, provide that sort of, how can it be like a catalyst for change, so to speak?
I think Telos as is the sole proprietor, so that's just me. I can always continue learning and growing, and taking risks, and then making amends for when I fail. Because my risks are for people. My risks are for, the marginalized group that is really, I think, the one that if we address access for people with disabilities, we'll get what all those Miss American people used to say, I want world peace, because it is that differences are advantages and people need one another aspect. And so I think that's what we can do, just one person at a time, just show people that invisible disabilities exist. You may not see someone as someone with a disability, and they might be going through their own identity of, do I have MS? Do I have ALS? You know, and they're in the beginning stages of that. And then you've got people who have lived their life with a disability. And how do we share experiences without comparing experiences? Because they say comparison is the thief of joy. I think I might get that wrong, but and then they say, but I like to say, and comparison is also the birth of imposter syndrome. And I think people in the disability community, if we celebrate our own diversity and listen to each other's shared experiences, then each one of us will make a difference, like a ripple in a pond, and it will just keep moving on. And we've got to teach each other how to network. We've got to teach each other how to, if you're not someone that needs alt text or image description, how can you do that for someone who does? Because that's your reach. We're a community and we are complex and passionate, and some people just need a rest and others are ready to step up. So how do we pass the torch? And I just try to pass the torch because I've had my own struggles and I don't think I want to compare them to other people, because I've never fought so hard to be a part of a community that's marginalized as I have as a, you know, as a middle-class white woman from Boise, Idaho in my 40s. So, but I'm very proud of our community and I think we're really diverse. And if we could stop comparing, that's how I just want to live my life. And hopefully it will help somebody else and then we'll just grow. And on March 4th, we'll have a big international ribbon cutting and some really good ceremony. And you'll just see lots of people with disabilities and lots of advocates and allies. And it will just be great celebration. So I just kind of follow Judy's path and see what I can do with my scope. It's a different than hers, but we both kind of started at camps in the woods. So I'll take that.
Mhm. That's awesome. That's awesome.